Hi, and welcome to Module 4, in which we'll discuss technological innovation strategy, the first part. You remember in the last couple of modules, specifically Module 3, we talked a little bit more about the macro level implications of innovation and kind of the structures and infrastructures that we've seen. Talked about platform ecosystems, we talked about modularity, et cetera, that can get a little abstract. And so we kind of want to go back to more firm level considerations, because that's also a little more relevant to what you will encounter in your career and in projects that you will be overseeing. But understanding how different technologies and different innovations are kind of built into kind of the more macro level perspectives does make a lot of sense, and is becoming increasingly important in terms of kind of building your overall innovation strategy. So we in module 4 and 5 will talk about, we will focus on that strategy part. Some of you, if you're an MBA student, you might have talked about competitive strategy before. So, be welcome to kind of skip that, but I'll keep a relative brief overview and all these factors just for you to kind of do a refresher, and that you have material for your final project, because these two sections, these two modules are particularly relevant. We'll talk about business models and other things as you'll see, and these are also things that I'm expecting you to include in your final write-ups. So for Module 4, we'll talk about appraising the firm's environment and articulating an ambitious strategic intent, and I'll talk more about what that means exactly. But let's start with market analysis. Again, most of you, or some of you, I think the majority of you will have seen this in some form or shape. Maybe you had to do it for a job, maybe you had to do it for another business class. And so this is not an exhaustive list of items and methodologies, but it gives a rough overview of things that are pretty important when we think about kind of the market for that specific technology or innovation that we're targeting. So if we want to think about market analysis, there is a few aspects that are important. First of all, we have to figure out what is our actual market, right? So how do we define the relevant market that we are trying to target? We want to put some numbers behind it, right? Market size, potential. We want to understand the competition. We want to understand buyer descriptors, right? So who's going to buy this technology and what are they going to do with it? Segment the market, prioritize who we're targeting, and then projecting your sales. Again, the sales projections are not the focus of this class, but I'm sure you will do this in either a marketing class or other classes that kind of focus a little bit more on sales and how we kind of calculate that. But here we want to just kind of broadly understand what our market looks like. There's a few parameters we have to consider. Most of you or all of you might have heard about business to business or business to consumer. Okay, so these are two very broad categories, but we can segment or split markets into other categories, such as geographic categories, economic categories, gender, or other demographics. And the important thing for us to do here is to understand where the bulk of our customers or users will come from, right? Typically 90%, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. We don't really want to be all over the place if we're gonna launch a new technology, or we're trying to position a new technology or innovation in the market. We have to be really laser focused. Now, there is a few ways we can quantify demand, for example. Typically, we use something called primary demand, which is the number of users or number of potential users or usage rates. You can also apply, come up with your own metrics here. And there is selective demand, which is, how many customers do my competitors have? or which of these customers could I target? And if you have already a business or a technology, I used to teach entrepreneurship, and a bunch of my students had their own businesses, and so they have to figure out how do I actually retain my customers, or which customers do I want to retain? Now, when we look at these demand gaps, typically when we see, every kind of industry category has a certain amount of sales. If we take the car industry, it might be in the hundreds of billions, potentially trillions of dollars in car sales. And what is the market potential, right? If you have an established category like the gasoline car, typically your market potential is kind of inching forward little by little, mostly driven by population growth. Now we have a bigger transition, right? We have electric vehicles. And so when Tesla essentially entered the market, the car market, they had to figure out what is the market potential of electric vehicles, right? Like, so how do we estimate that? Now, and again, if you're looking at selective demand gaps, that's mostly I'm looking at other companies or other firms that provide a similar product or are kind of have like a substitute product. How much are their sales, and how do we, like where are the gaps? Like, could they do better, or could we kind of grab some of that, some of those sales? When we think about market potential, right, and so how do we estimate that? That can be tricky sometimes. In most cases, we have to invent our own methodology. This is, I don't expect you to come up, with something publishable in a journal. I just want you to kind of think about what are the pieces of information that you have or you have access to, and how can you weave it together so you can make a logical, systematic, and evidence-based argument about what your market potential looks like here. It won't be exact, okay, because again, you're estimating potential. If you had exact numbers, you wouldn't look at innovations, right? You would try to sell existing products. And so that's why there's certainly some leeway in terms of where these numbers, how these numbers kind of fit together, and what kind of information you have access to. I'll use a quick example. I used to teach in Wilmington, North Carolina, and a lot of my students were somewhat engaged in photography, commercial photography. Some students used drones to do that. Some students did direct photography. And so we I kind of developed this little exercise just to kind of demonstrate you how we can get started, what kind of measures can we develop here, and where can I find that information data. Okay, so if you do a little Google search, okay, and kind of we think about this methodologically, right? What do we, if I want to start a wedding photography business in Wilmington, North Carolina, I'll need to figure out a couple of things, right? So first of all, how much do people spend on weddings, right? Turns out it's about roughly 20 to 23,000. I'll show you in a graphic in the next slide. There's a little bit of variation there. 15% of the wedding costs tend to be paid to photography services, and of those 15%, 20% are video. Okay, that's kind of what is being charged and what it costs. You have about 2,500 weddings in Wilmington, North Carolina each year, right? So that's typically your total approachable market in Wilmington. And then if you put these things together, you can actually kind of define your market, right? Like what kind of, how much sales do we have? What is the amount of sales or amount of revenue we have in that market over a year? And this is, you can look all this up online. Turns out there is about, in 2018, there were about 68,000 weddings, okay? So the market in Wilmington is relatively small, right? But that could be okay if you have, for example, good access to it. If you know a lot of people, that could be a good entry point for you to do this business. Again, this is not a high technology or high innovation idea, but it's kind of giving us a little bit of a example of how we can put these things together. Let's say you want to develop or sell professional suits, right? How would you estimate that? You could try to target everybody, right? Male, female. You could look at women specifically, right? You look at so 320 million Americans, 51% are female, 35% of females wear big and tall sizes, 23% of females are such and such and such, right? So you kind of start putting those numbers together, and there we go, right? So you can get, how how much an average professional suit costs, how many professional suits females or males, depending on which market you want to target, own, and then you have about an estimate of how large that market is, right? Now, when we think about market descriptors, right, there's a few questions that make sense for us to ask. Is, first of all, who buys, right? So who is the person or people or individuals that I'm trying to target? How are they buying, right? Are they buying that suit in a store? Are they buying it online, right? Because distribution channels and how I purchase something is important for me to understand if I want to kind of approach them. When are they buying, right? Are there particular seasons when customers do that? Why are they buying it? What are they buying? And where are they buying? And again, right, so we don't want to be ideological here. We want to look for the evidence that tries to support our assumptions and our pitch, right? That could be raw numbers, demographics, psychographics, social patterns, usage patterns, et cetera, right? As long as they are related to our main pitch or our main hypothesis. When we think about business-to-business markets, right, we need to think about gatekeepers, influencers, deciders, buyers, and users, right? So often you're not really need to convince the user to begin with, right? You're trying to convince the organization, and the organization has somebody who's responsible for purchasing. And so these people, maybe along with others, make purchasing decisions. So you have to target your initiatives to them and figure out what do they need, how are they buying, what are they looking for, etc., etc. Typically, okay, and this is kind of a simplified way of how customers are buying, right? There needs to be some kind of need recognition. There's information search, alternative evaluation, purchase decision making, and post-purchase evaluation. You can apply that to pretty much any purchase you can think of: housing, cars, food, etc., etc. This, how this exactly looks like for each of these purchases might be different, but generally we follow that pattern for when we buy things. Think about what type of purchase is triggering what sorts of buying processes or buying research, right? So if you're buying a Snickers bar or a chewing gum, that has different implications, or you have different marketing tools to address that. If you buy a car or a suit, or if you buy a house or college selection, or you select your college or your master's program, these are different involvement purchases, right? And so therefore the buying process and the decision making will look a little different. Now, again, right, so the point is here just to provide a general overview and kind of develop some basic understanding of who is your buyer, who is your user, etc., etc. You want to match your buying process to the selling process, right? That seems kind of simple and trivial, but it's important, right? So how do you create awareness? How do you create interest, preference, how do you close the sale, and how you build relationship. What kind of order are you going to put in the selling process, right? How do you target people specifically? In this case, okay, let's say you wanna, depending on what you're selling, right? What kind of technologies or what kind of innovations you wanna address, right? So you might have publicity releases, trade journal ads, social media. You wanna generate some leads, and you can do that through social media as well, right? Very strategically and very targeted. You have to think about your follow-up contact, right? So how do you engage with users or potential clients or potential customers here? Then you might need to do a demo, right? Especially if you're developing a technology or you want to sell a technology, you want to get investment. You need to potentially have a prototype, right? Ideally a working prototype, so that investors can see and can have a better intuition about whether you have a legitimate innovation at hand or whether you're too far away from being invested in. Closing the sale, building the relationship, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of options here. Again, this is not a marketing class. I just try to provide a brief overview so that we can kind of share similar vocabulary in that process. And that concludes the first section of Module 4. In the next one, we will be talking about customer segmentation.